So you want to get into the nitty-gritty of how assets are carved up under Indian insolvency law, right? Specifically, you're interested in Section 53 of the IBC, 2016.
That's a popular one.
Yeah, it's the one that outlines who gets paid first when a company in India goes belly up and how they try to make sure both creditors and workers are treated fairly.
Right. It's a tricky balance.
It is. It's like walking a tightrope. So for our listeners, imagine a company here in India facing insolvency. The big question becomes, who gets to claim the remaining assets?
It's not a free-for-all, that's for sure.
Definitely not. India uses this structured system, kind of like a waterfall, to prioritize different types of claims.
Exactly.
And what I find fascinating is how this system reflects India's commitment to both, honoring contracts and looking out for social welfare. It's a blend you don't always see.
Absolutely. It's woven into the very fabric of the process. The Indian insolvency system always tries first to rescue the company.
Like throwing them a lifeline.
Yeah. It's only when that fails that they move to liquidation, which is basically selling off the assets to settle debts. It's a last resort. Like, nobody wants to end up dividing up their belongings, right?
Right. It's kind of like the corporate equivalent of beyond repair at that point.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, why does India see such a high percentage of these cases actually ending in liquidation?
Yeah.
There's a bigger economic story there, I think, but let's stick with the process itself for now, especially that waterfall idea.
Okay.
What are the key levels, and what's the thinking behind the order they're in?
Okay. So picture this. The company's assets are like a reservoir, right?
Okay, I like it.
And you've got all these claimants lined up with their jugs waiting to collect.
Okay.
Section 53 of the IBC, that's our waterfall, dictates who gets to fill their jugs first and in what order. Naturally, the costs associated with the insolvency process itself, the liquidation costs, all that.
Right.
That gets taken off the top. Think of it like covering the administrative costs of this whole thing.
Makes sense. You got to pay the people managing this whole process, right?
Exactly.
So that's the first level, the administrative costs. What comes after that?
This is where it gets really interesting. The second tier of the waterfall, this is where the legal obligations and social priorities really meet. Here, you have two types of claims that are considered equal: workmen's dues and secured creditors.
So workmen's dues, that's things like unpaid wages, right? And those are considered just as important as the claims of secured creditors who, let's be honest, often have a lot of financial weight behind them.
Exactly. And this focus on worker welfare is quite unique, actually, to the Indian system. It recognizes that when a company goes under, it's often the employees who are hit the hardest.
It makes sense. So how does that work in practice? Does that mean if a worker is owed back wages, they could potentially get the same amount as, say, a bank that gave the company a huge loan?
Not necessarily. While both workmen's dues and secured creditors have equal priority at the second level, the actual amount they get depends on a few things, like how much is actually left and the size of their claim.
Right. So it's equal priority, but not necessarily equal payout.
Right.
Let's unpack secured creditors a bit more, though. Some people might not know what a security interest really means in this context.
Sure. A secured creditor is essentially someone who lent money with the understanding that if things go south, they have a claim on a specific asset of the company.
Like collateral.
Exactly, collateral. So let's say a company gets a loan to buy a fancy new machine. That machine becomes the secured asset. If the company goes bust, the lender, the secured creditor, has the right to seize and sell that machine to get their money back.
So they've got a direct claim on a piece of the pie, so to speak, whereas workmen are relying on whatever's left after those secured claims are dealt with.
That's the gist of it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Secured creditors actually have a choice to make. They can decide to enforce their security interests directly, meaning they could seize and sell the secured asset even before the whole liquidation process begins.
I could see how that would be appealing. Get in there early, maybe recoup a bigger chunk of what you're owed, especially if you think there won't be much left later on.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing it's not always that simple.
Not always, no. It can get pretty complicated if you have multiple secured creditors all going after different assets. Imagine a scenario where different lenders have their eyes on different parts of a company's operations. If they all try to act independently,
It sounds like a recipe for a headache.
it can be, especially if the value of the secured assets ends up being less than what's owed in total.
Yeah, that's never good.
No. This is why a lot of secured creditors will choose to just participate in the waterfall distribution process instead.
So it's like, weigh the potential benefits of going rogue versus playing it safe, even if it means some uncertainty about how much they'll actually recover.
You got it. It's a gamble, really.
Isn't it always? It's fascinating, though. Even at this early stage, there's already this balancing act between, like, legal rights, practical concerns, and the potential for things to get messy.
Oh, absolutely. And we've only just dipped our toes into the tiers of this waterfall.
I was just going to say, there's more, right?
Oh, there's more, much more. We haven't even talked about where the rest of the employees land, or unsecured creditors, or even what happens to the government's claims.
All very important, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into next time. So we're back, and we're really getting into the weeds of India's insolvency waterfall. We've talked about secured creditors and workmen's dues in that second tier.
Right.
But what about the rest of the employees, the ones who weren't included in that initial 24-month window for prioritized dues? Where do they fit in?
That's an important point. The IBC doesn't forget about them. They actually fall under the third tier of the waterfall.
So they're still ahead of some other creditors, even if they're not at the very top.
Okay. Exactly. The third tier specifically deals with any money owed to employees for the 12 months leading up to when the liquidation process officially starts.
Okay, so there's still an effort to make sure those workers' rights are acknowledged, even in the middle of this whole liquidation process.
Absolutely. The legislation recognizes the impact this has on employees and tries to offer some protection, even if it's not as extensive as what those in that initial 24-month window receive.
That makes sense. So after the employees, who else is in line, waiting for a share of whatever assets are left?
Next up, you've got your unsecured financial creditors.
So those are lenders who, unlike the secured creditors we talked about earlier, didn't back up their loans with any specific company assets.
You got it.
So they're in a riskier position, right?
Yeah.
They have to wait their turn, and it's not guaranteed they'll see a cent.
Exactly. It's a lot less certain for them, especially if there's not much left of the company's assets.
And what about the government? They must be in the mix somewhere, right? With taxes and all that.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
I would.
But surprisingly, the government's claims are actually pretty low on the priority list.
Oh, wow. Lower than unsecured creditors, even.
Even lower, yeah.
That's wild. Why is that? I mean, you'd think the government would be first in line.
It's a policy decision, really. It's about prioritizing the needs of workers and those who are owed money, putting them ahead of the government's own claims.
So they're taking a step back, acknowledging that it's more important for debts to be repaid and for people to be compensated before the government collects.
Exactly. It's about the bigger economic picture.
Interesting. So if we go back to our waterfall analogy, by the time the government gets to collect, it's just a trickle.
Often, yeah, pretty much.
And then even further down, with even slimmer chances, are what they call other claimants.
Right.
That doesn't sound like a good place to be.
Not at all. By that stage, there's rarely much left to go around.
That's the tough reality of insolvency, isn't it? Even with a system like this waterfall, there are going to be some who are left with next to nothing.
Unfortunately, yes. It really highlights the complexities and sometimes the harsh realities of this whole process.
Speaking of complexities, we talked earlier about how secured creditors have a choice. Enforce their security interests directly or go through the waterfall. Have there been any major cases that show just how tricky that decision can be?
Oh, absolutely. One that comes to mind involved a real estate company, Synergy's Dore Realty Limited, that went belly up.
Okay.
They had a secured creditor, LIC Housing Finance, and they decided to try and cut to the front of the line, enforcing their security interests directly.
So they went rogue, hoping for a bigger payout.
That was the idea. But of course, it wasn't that simple. Other stakeholders took them to court, arguing that this wasn't fair and that LIC Housing Finance going solo was actually hurting their chances of getting anything back.
So even with a structured system like this waterfall, there's still room for disputes, different interpretations of how it should all play out.
Exactly. That case really shows how delicate this balancing act is in insolvency proceedings. The courts have to weigh the rights of individual creditors against the overall goal of getting the most value out of the assets for everyone involved.
It's not just a theoretical thing. It has real consequences for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And these cases, they set precedents, influencing what other creditors might do in the future if they're facing the same kind of situation.
This has been eye-opening, to say the least. We've really dug into the mechanics of this waterfall system, especially when it comes to Section 53 of the IBC.
It's a fascinating piece of legislation.
It is, but it's also complex. And what's clear is it's not just about the rules themselves, but also about how they're interpreted and applied in real-life situations.
It's constantly evolving, for sure.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be digging into next, including some really interesting case law surrounding workmen's dues. We're back again, still swimming in the deep end of Indian insolvency law.
Still here, still diving.
And, we spent a good chunk of time talking about this waterfall mechanism in Section 53, how it prioritizes different claims.
Right, that's the framework.
But it's not always a clear-cut process, is it? Like you mentioned earlier, figuring out what exactly qualifies as workmen's dues can be tricky.
You're right. The IBC, it gives a broad definition, but there have been so many cases that have gone to court.
And each one is a little different, right?
Every single one. So our understanding of what fits under that umbrella of workmen's dues, it's constantly evolving.
So for our listeners, it's not as simple as just looking at unpaid salaries. What are some examples of those gray areas you're talking about?
Well, there was this one case, a company went into liquidation, and they owed their employees a bunch of earned leave.
Okay.
And the big question was, were those unpaid leave days, did they count as workmen's dues under the IBC?
Interesting. I can see how that wouldn't be immediately clear. So what happened? What did the court decide?
The court really dug into the intention behind the IBC.
Makes sense.
They wanted to make sure workers were protected, and they ended up ruling that, yeah, earned leave, that represents work that's already been done, so it should be treated as workmen's dues.
Wow, so that set a precedent, essentially saying, hey, we're serious about compensating employees, even beyond just their regular wages.
Exactly. It was a big deal. And it's just one example, really. Another case that really highlighted the complexities of workmen's dues, it involved retrenchment benefits.
Right, those are the payments made to employees who are let go, right?
Exactly. So in this case, the court had to decide how to calculate those benefits. Should it be based on the employee's last salary?
Okay.
Or should it be based on what they would have earned if they'd stayed with the company until retirement?
Oh, wow. I can imagine that could be a huge difference in the amount.
Huge, especially for someone who'd been with the company for a long time.
So what did they decide?
They ended up going with the hypothetical salary.
The one they would have earned.
Yep. Even though that might seem like the more generous option, they felt it was more in line with what the IBC was trying to do, provide a safety net for workers who lose their jobs because of these situations.
It's like they were looking at the bigger picture, the long-term impact on those employees.
Exactly. And what these cases show is that legal interpretation, it's not just some abstract thing. It directly affects how this law plays out in the real world. It's dynamic.
Yeah, and it highlights how important the courts are in all of this. They're not just going by the letter of the law. They're really trying to understand the spirit of it.
Absolutely. They're the ones who add the nuance, who make sure the IBC can actually handle the complexities of these situations.
This whole deep dive has been fascinating, to say the least. We've gone from the mechanics of this waterfall system to the intricacies of workmen's dues, and we've seen how legal interpretation really breathes life into the legislation.
It's been quite a journey through Section 53.
It has. And what's become clear is that this area of law, it's not static. It's constantly evolving. Every insolvency case presents its own unique challenges.
And the courts, they're right there on the front lines with every case.
Absolutely. So for anyone listening who's involved in this world, whether it's business, law, or just trying to understand the financial landscape, this is an area to keep your eye on.
Definitely. Stay informed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Section 53. We'll be back soon with more explorations of the intricate world of insolvency and beyond. Until then, stay curious.